August 31st, 1944. The German army is retreating in absolute chaos, leaving the path through Lorraine nearly wide open. General George S. Patton's vanguard units have just seized Verdun and are crossing the Meuse River, poised to shatter the remaining enemy defences. Then, a sudden, dead halt. The mighty Third Army is paralysed. They are not stopped by fierce German resistance or impassable terrain. They are stopped dead because they do not receive a single gallon of gasoline. A relentless pursuit turns into a forced, multi-day standstill. What could instantly paralyse an advancing military machine when the enemy was completely unable to do so? The answer to that question is one of the most bizarre paradoxes of the Second World War. At the exact moment Patton's Sherman tanks were coasting to a silent, grinding halt along the roads of eastern France, coughing on bone-dry engines, a staggering logistical reality existed just a few hundred miles in their rearview mirrors. There was no actual shortage. Back on the secured beaches of Normandy and in the sprawling depots dotting the French coastline, millions of gallons of gasoline were safely stockpiled. Mountains of steel jerrycans sat untouched under the late summer sun, alongside endless crates of rations and artillery shells. The Allied war machine possessed an absolute, almost unfathomable abundance of resources. They had everything they needed to finish the job. But that ocean of gasoline might as well have been on the moon, because the Allies had completely lost the ability to bring it forward. It was a trap built entirely out of victory. A spectacular, lightning-fast advance across France had created a situation where the front line was sprinting away from its own lifeblood. The very speed that had just shattered the German army was now systematically breaking the American supply system. And in modern mechanized warfare, momentum is everything. By outrunning their own logistics, the Americans were inadvertently handing a devastated, panicking German high command the one resource it desperately begged for: time. Time to stop running, time to rearm, and time to resurrect a hardened defensive front along their own borders. It is a chilling lesson in military strategy. The Americans were not halted by a lack of resources, but by the sheer impossibility of moving their own endless wealth fast enough. How did winning too fast suddenly become the single greatest threat to the Allied advance? To understand how a victorious army accidentally chokes itself, we have to look at the blueprints drawn up months before the first boots hit the beaches of Normandy. When Allied planners locked in highly secure rooms in London mapped out the invasion of Europe, they did not anticipate a lightning-fast sprint across the continent. They anticipated a brutal, methodical, and agonizingly slow grind. The master timetable for Operation Overlord was heavily influenced by the grueling experiences of the First World War and the bloody, inch-by-inch fighting seen in Italy. Planners projected a measured advance, drawing phase lines on maps that dictated exactly where the front should be on any given day. According to these meticulously calculated schedules, it was supposed to take the Allies nearly a full year to reach the German border. The entire logistical backbone of the invasion was engineered for this sluggish pace. Supply dumps, maintenance depots, and massive fuel farms were designed to be established slowly, creeping forward right behind a slowly shifting front line. Everything was anchored to the assumption that engineers would have weeks, if not months, to rebuild captured French rail networks and establish forward supply bases before the combat units moved too far ahead. For the first 7 weeks after D-Day, reality matched those grim predictions. Through June and most of July, American and British forces were locked in a miserable, static meat grinder in the Norman hedgerows. Advances were measured in yards. Supply officers easily dumped millions of tons of equipment right on the beaches and in the immediate hinterland, effortlessly tossing boxes over the shoulders of troops who were fighting just a few miles inland. The logistics system looked brilliant because it was not being asked to move. The combat units were practically sitting on top of their own warehouses. But then the entire paradigm of the war on the Western Front violently fractured. On July 25th, 1944, General Omar Bradley launched Operation Cobra. After a devastating carpet bombing campaign that obliterated the German defences outside Saint-Lô, the American armoured divisions finally punched through the dense bocage and broke out into the open French countryside. The static war was instantly over. Mechanised warfare took over, and the true capability of the American tank divisions was unleashed. The German command, completely unprepared for the speed of this armoured rupture, attempted a desperate counterattack at Mortain, which only sealed their doom. By mid-August, Allied forces had enveloped the bulk of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Wehrmacht. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured, and the roads of Normandy were choked with the charred, twisted wreckage of destroyed panzer divisions. The crust of the German defence had not just been broken, it had been entirely vaporised. Suddenly, the agonisingly slow phase lines drawn on the planners' maps in London were rendered completely obsolete. There was no organised enemy resistance left to hold back the tide. The road across France lay wide open. Sensing that the entire German military apparatus in the West was collapsing, Allied commanders made the only logical tactical choice. They ordered their armies to pursue the shattered enemy relentlessly. They pushed the accelerator to the floor. General George S. Patton, now commanding the newly activated Third Army, drove his armoured columns eastward with a ferocious, unrelenting energy. Instead of advancing a few miles a day, American mechanised units were suddenly devouring territory, tearing across the French landscape at speeds that shocked even their own generals. They raced toward the Seine, liberated Paris, and kept pushing toward the Meuse River and the German frontier. In a matter of mere weeks, the front line surged eastward by 300 to 500 kilometres. It was a spectacular, intoxicating triumph. But it was also a logistical nightmare taking shape in real time. As the combat elements of the army sprinted eastward, the massive, cumbersome tail of the military remained stubbornly glued to the western coast. The deep water ports, the specialised unloading facilities, the sprawling staging areas, and the enormous, heavily guarded fuel farms could not simply pack up and roll forward. They were static installations, tethered to the geography of the coastline. While Patton's tanks were tearing through the French countryside, generating headlines and inspiring awe back home, the men responsible for keeping those tanks running were watching the situation maps with growing horror. The pre-planned logistical infrastructure, the carefully choreographed system of railheads and intermediate depots, had been left completely in the dust. The combat engineers had not been given the months they needed to rebuild the heavily bombed French railway network. The supply trains simply could not follow the tanks. In a matter of days, the entire supply chain was effectively severed from its primary mode of heavy transport. This created a profound, escalating conflict between the speed of a modern mechanised combat force and the static, overwhelmingly heavy nature of its logistical support. An armoured division is a hungry, demanding organism. It requires mountains of artillery shells, daily medical supplies, rations for thousands of men, and most importantly, an unceasing river of petroleum. When the combat troops were sitting in Normandy, delivering that river was simple. But as the armies surged past Paris and deep into eastern France, every single gallon of fuel, every single crate of ammunition, and every single box of rations had to be hauled by road over an increasingly massive void. The front line was no longer just a few miles from the beach. It was hundreds of miles away, and it was moving further eastward every single hour. The umbilical cord connecting the fighting men to their lifeblood was stretching thinner and thinner across the ruined, congested roads of a newly liberated nation. The American military found itself in uncharted territory, attempting to sustain a massive multi-army offensive exclusively via road transport over distances that defied all existing military doctrine. The combat commanders, looking through their binoculars at the fleeing, disorganised remnants of the German army, saw only opportunity. They saw a shattered enemy and a war that could potentially be won by Christmas if they just kept moving. But the supply officers, staring at the rapidly widening gap between the massive fuel dumps in Normandy and the dry tank treads in Lorraine, saw an impending, unavoidable catastrophe. The further the tanks drove, the harder it became to keep them armed and fueled. The stunning, unprecedented speed of the advance had transformed the geography of France from a battlefield into a silent adversary. The vast open expanse between the coast and the front lines was no longer just an inconvenience. It contained a brutal mathematical trap that was actively strangling the offensive. The nature of that mathematical trap was rooted in the unforgiving physics of internal combustion. In a motorised army, every single mile the front line advances eastward means a supply truck must drive 1 extra mile to reach the combat troops, and 1 extra mile to return to the depot. That is 2 additional miles of engine runtime, 2 additional miles of burning the exact same resource that the truck is supposed to be delivering. As the distance between the Normandy beaches and the spearheads in eastern France expanded, this equation began to consume the American military from the inside out. A standard 2.5-ton cargo truck, heavily laden with steel jerry cans and navigating cratered, congested French roads, consumed an enormous amount of fuel simply existing. When the front lines were only 50 miles away, a truck could deliver a massive payload with a minimal operational cost. But by late August, the distance from the coastal depots to the vanguard had stretched to 300, and in some sectors, over 400 miles. This meant an 800-mile round trip for a single delivery. At that extreme distance, the math violently turns against the attacker. To maintain its blistering, relentless momentum, General George S. Patton's Third Army required roughly 350,000 gallons of gasoline every single day. That was the absolute minimum required to keep the Sherman tanks rolling, the half-tracks moving, and the heavy artillery tractors pulling their guns. Patton was looking through his binoculars at a crumbling German army, fiercely demanding that 350,000-gallon lifeblood to deliver the knockout blow. But the supply officers tracking the convoys realized a terrifying reality. To get that fuel across the vast, expanding void of liberated France, the transportation network had to burn its own fuel to make the trip. At the peak of this logistical nightmare, the supply trucks themselves were burning nearly 300,000 gallons of gasoline a day just navigating the immense distances. The American military was literally consuming its own lifeblood, simply trying to deliver it. For every gallon of fuel that actually splashed into the tank of a frontline combat vehicle, nearly another gallon was being burned by the cargo trucks grinding their way along the highways and back. It was a logistical death spiral. You could not simply add more trucks to the route to solve the problem, because adding more trucks meant adding more engines that required even more fuel from the rear depots, compounding the very shortage they were sent to relieve. The laws of physics, distance, and fuel consumption were actively working against American military ambition. No amount of fighting spirit, aggressive leadership, or tactical brilliance could negotiate with an empty gas tank. The faster Patton pushed his armoured divisions toward the German border, the tighter the noose of this mathematical trap pulled around his own neck. The distance was doing what the Wehrmacht had entirely failed to do. It was suffocating the American offensive. With the mechanised charge dying on the vine and cargo trucks burning the very fuel they were meant to deliver, the entire Allied strategy was teetering on the edge of a humiliating collapse. The conventional rules of supply and transport had shattered under the sheer velocity of the advance. If the High Command wanted to keep the armies moving, they could not rely on standard military doctrine. They had to invent a radical, desperate, and completely unprecedented solution overnight. On August 25, 1944, recognising that the conventional supply doctrine had completely disintegrated, the Allied command initiated a desperate, unprecedented improvisation. If the carefully planned logistical network could not organically keep pace with the fighting front, they would have to forcefully hijack their own military infrastructure to manufacture a lifeline. The High Command issued an emergency order that sent shockwaves through the newly arrived infantry units in France. Combat commanders of the 26th, 95th and 104th Infantry Divisions, men who had just landed and were eagerly preparing to join the fight, were suddenly stripped of their transportation. Supply officers descended on their motor pools, commandeering every single heavy cargo vehicle they possessed. In an instant, 3 full combat divisions were temporarily immobilised, their foot soldiers left sitting uselessly in the mud of staging areas, just so their trucks could be thrown into a massive, frantic logistical gamble. This was the birth of the Red Bull Express. The name itself was borrowed from civilian railway terminology, where a red dot on a freight car indicated high-priority cargo that had to bypass all normal traffic. But this was not a railway. It was a makeshift highway system forged out of the battered, crater-scarred roads of rural France. Engineers rapidly designated a closed-loop, one-way highway stretching from the Normandy beachheads all the way toward the front lines. The northern route was strictly reserved for empty trucks returning to the coast, while the southern route became a relentless eastbound conveyor belt of fuel, rations and ammunition. Civilian traffic was completely banned. Military police were stationed at every major intersection, waving the convoys through with ruthless efficiency. Almost overnight, nearly 6,000 trucks were hurled onto this dedicated circuit. The rules of the road were strict. Vehicles were ordered to travel in organised convoys, maintain a distance of 60 feet between bumpers, and never exceed a speed limit of 25 miles per hour. But almost immediately, the sheer desperation of the frontline units caused those rules to evaporate. The speed limits were ignored. Governors were ripped off carburetors by resourceful mechanics to squeeze every ounce of speed out of the engines. Convoys fractured into autonomous packs of speeding metal, roaring through the French countryside in a choking cloud of dust and diesel exhaust. The American command had successfully created a motorized blood vessel to keep the armoured spearheads alive, but the sheer scale of the operation demanded an impossible human sacrifice. A logistical conveyor belt is only a concept drawn on a map until you put human beings behind the wheels. And the men who physically carried the weight of the Allied advance on their shoulders were overwhelmingly African American soldiers. In the strictly segregated United States military of 1944, black troops were routinely sidelined from frontline combat roles, relegated by systemic prejudice to quartermaster, engineering and transportation battalions. The military establishment often viewed these support units as secondary to the war effort. Yet, in the critical deciding window of late August, the fate of the entire Western Front suddenly rested squarely in their exhausted hands. These men were asked to perform a physical miracle under conditions that bordered on the inhumane. The trucks they drove, primarily the GMC 2.5-ton cargo trucks affectionately known as the Deuce and a Half, were unforgiving machines. They had no power steering, no climate control, and heavy, grinding manual transmissions. The military had rated these trucks to carry 5,000 pounds of cargo. In the desperation of the Red Ball Express, they were routinely loaded with 10,000 pounds of highly explosive fuel and artillery shells.
Drivers wrestled these massively overloaded, top-heavy behemoths over roads that had been chewed up by tank treads and pulverised by months of Allied carpet bombing. According to official regulations, drivers were supposed to rotate, getting adequate rest between runs. The reality of the crisis meant that these regulations were entirely abandoned. Men drove for 36, sometimes 48 hours straight without sleep. They subsisted on cold sea rations, eaten with one hand on the steering wheel, and coffee brewed on hot engine manifolds. As day turned to night, the danger escalated exponentially. To avoid the ever-present threat of lingering German aircraft, the Red Ball Express operated entirely under blackout conditions. The trucks were forbidden from using their standard headlights. Instead, they relied on cat eyes, tiny, heavily hooded slits of light that illuminated only a few faint feet of the road immediately ahead of the bumper.
Driving a 5-ton rolling bomb at 40 miles an hour through pitch-black French towns, relying only on the faint red taillight of the truck in front of you, induced a hypnotic, deadly fatigue. Drivers experienced profound sleep deprivation, fighting off intense hallucinations in the dead of night. Men reported seeing phantom buildings in the road, or thinking the dark shadows of trees were German soldiers stepping into their path. When a driver could no longer keep his eyes open, he would pull over, slump over the steering wheel for 20 minutes of exhausted sleep, and then jolt awake to merge back into the endless, roaring stream of traffic. Accidents were frequent and brutal. Overloaded trucks blew tyres and rolled into ditches, spilling precious fuel and crushing the men inside. Yet the convoys could not stop to aid the wrecked vehicles. The orders were to keep moving at all costs. The maintenance battalions, also working 24 hours a day, were drowning in a tsunami of broken machinery. They cannibalized wrecked trucks on the side of the road, swapping axles and transmissions in the mud, just to keep the surviving vehicles in the rotation. The African-American soldiers of the Red Ball Express were not just driving. They were fighting a brutal, grueling war of attrition against distance, mechanical friction, and their own collapsing bodies. They kept the pedal pressed to the floorboard because they knew exactly what was happening at the other end of the line. At the absolute tip of that line, General George S. Patton was staring at a map that seemed to promise the immediate destruction of the Third Reich. By the end of August, his vanguard units had seized Verdun and successfully crossed the Meuse River. The heavily fortified German border was agonizingly close. Through his field glasses, Patton could see a Wehrmacht that was completely shattered. German units were retreating in absolute disarray, leaving behind their heavy equipment, their command structures severed, their morale reduced to ash. Patton, a commander who understood the psychology of momentum better than almost anyone, knew that this was a singular, fleeting window in history. He believed that if he could just keep his armoured columns pushing eastward for a few more days, he could slice straight through the German defences before the enemy even had time to man the bunkers. He saw a direct, unhindered path into the industrial heartland of Germany. He truly believed he could end the war in 1944. But right at the zenith of his triumph, the engines of the Third Army began to sputter and die. The Shermans coasted to the sides of the roads. The half-tracks fell silent. The heavy artillery tractors stopped in their tracks. The deafening roar of the mechanized advance was abruptly replaced by the eerie, quiet rustle of the French wind. Patton's army was paralyzed, frozen in place by dry fuel tanks. Patton was apoplectic. The man who famously drove his subordinates to the breaking point was suddenly powerless, tethered to the ground by a lack of gasoline. He bombarded the high command with frantic, furious demands for fuel. He reportedly declared that his men could eat their belts, but his tanks absolutely had to have gas. He refused to accept the logistical reality, convinced that Supreme Headquarters was simply lacking the aggressive willpower to finish a wounded enemy. Driven by a relentless tactical urgency, Patton ordered his officers to procure fuel by any means necessary. Elements of the Third Army essentially turned into armed highwaymen. They set up unauthorized checkpoints, rerouted supply convoys meant for other divisions, and sent raiding parties to commandeer fuel dumps that legally belonged to the First Army. It was a chaotic, desperate scramble to squeeze just a few more miles out of a dying momentum. But these aggressive, unauthorized tactics were merely drops in a massive, empty bucket. Patton was not fighting the enemy anymore. He was fighting a map. And on that map, his Third Army was just one piece of a much larger, impossibly complex puzzle that was fundamentally breaking down. While Patton stared furiously eastward at the retreating Germans, General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley were forced to look at a terrifyingly wide strategic picture. From their headquarters, the war was not just a single spearhead driving toward Germany, it was a massive, sprawling front line stretching from the Swiss border all the way to the English Channel. And every single unit along that massive front was screaming for the exact same fuel that Patton was demanding. The Red Ball Express, for all its desperate heroism and the thousands of trucks grinding their gears to dust, was only delivering a fraction of the tonnage required to sustain the entire Allied thrust. It was a spectacular improvisation, but it was mathematically incapable of supplying multiple advancing field armies simultaneously. Eisenhower was faced with a brutal zero-sum calculus. There simply was not enough gasoline to go around. If he gave every available drop of fuel to Patton for a single, deep knife thrust into Germany, he would have to completely halt General Courtney Hodges' First Army in the centre, and General Bernard Montgomery's British and Canadian forces in the north. Patton's flanks would be left dangerously exposed, sticking out hundreds of miles into enemy territory with zero support. But more importantly, Eisenhower was looking at the root cause of the crisis. The entire logistical nightmare existed because the Allies were still hauling every single bullet and jerrycan over hundreds of miles from the beaches of Normandy. To truly fix the broken supply chain, they desperately needed a massive, deep-water port much closer to the German border.
The strategic prize was the Belgian port city of Antwerp. If the Allies could capture Antwerp and clear its heavily defended approaches, ocean-going transport ships could bypass France entirely and unload millions of tons of supplies right on Germany's doorstep. But Antwerp lay in the north, in the operational sector of Montgomery's army group. Therefore, the harsh, inescapable reality of grand strategy dictated the outcome. Eisenhower made the excruciating decision to prioritise the northern advance. The fuel had to flow toward Antwerp.
Patton's Third Army, poised on the brink of a historic breakthrough, was ordered to stand down. It was not a conspiracy against a controversial general, nor was it a failure of nerve. It was the cold, uncompromising mathematics of global logistics. You cannot win a mechanised war without gasoline, and you cannot get gasoline without a working port. The decision was strategically sound, perhaps even inevitable, but it came with a staggering consequence that would alter the timeline of the war. To understand the true cost of this logistical paralysis, one must look at the battlefield from the perspective of the German High Command. In the final days of August, the mood within the Wehrmacht headquarters was one of pure, unadulterated panic. The disaster at the Falaise Pocket had essentially erased their Western armies. General Walter Model, sent directly by Hitler to stabilise the catastrophe, found himself commanding phantom divisions. Units existed only on paper.
The retreat across France had devolved into a frantic, disorganised rout. The German generals were backing into the Lorraine region, fully expecting the horizon to erupt at any moment with American Sherman tanks. They knew perfectly well that their hastily dug trenches and scattered, exhausted infantry battalions were no match for a concentrated armoured assault. They braced for complete annihilation, believing the Americans would seamlessly punch through their fragile lines and cross the Rhine River. But then, a strange, terrifying silence fell over the front. Day after day, the expected American armoured tidal wave did not materialise. German reconnaissance units pushing cautiously westward to locate the enemy spearheads discovered a bizarre reality. They found Patton's legendary armoured columns sitting silently on the roads, their crews lounging on the hulls, making no aggressive moves. The Americans were not manoeuvring to flank. They were not pausing to concentrate artillery fire.
They were simply parked. Slowly, the dawn of realization crept through the German command structure. The Americans had not stopped out of tactical caution. The mighty, seemingly invincible Allied war machine had literally outrun its own supplies. The shift in the German psychological state was profound and immediate. The blind panic of a shattered army evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculated tactical opportunism. They realized they had just been handed a miracle. The Americans were temporarily trapped by their own speed, and in that agonizing pause, the Wehrmacht was given the one thing no military strategy can invent: time. The Red Ball Express was hailed as a miracle of logistics, proudly featured in newsreels as a flawless triumph of American industrial might. But beneath the surface, this improvised machine was tearing itself apart. The wartime documentaries broadcast to theatres back in the United States projected an image of absolute mechanical supremacy. Audiences saw endless, perfectly spaced convoys of GMC trucks rolling eastward, a testament to Detroit's manufacturing power and American organisational genius. But those heavily censored reels hid a terrifying statistical reality. The Red Ball Express was not a sustainable supply line. It was a desperate, self-destructive sprint that was actively burning out the United States Army. By the first week of September, the physical toll on the fleet had reached catastrophic levels. The mathematics of overloading vehicles by 200% while running them 24 hours a day over pulverised pavement finally caught up with the motor pools. Tyres, chewed to shreds by sharp debris, jagged asphalt and discarded shrapnel, blew out at a staggering rate. There were no replacements coming fast enough. When a tyre violently detonated under the weight of 5 tons of high-octane aviation fuel or artillery shells, the truck often careened out of control, rolling into ditches and taking other vehicles with it in the pitch blackness of the blackout routes. The maintenance battalions were completely overwhelmed by this tidal wave of mechanical carnage. Ordnance units that were supposed to perform routine tune-ups found themselves operating open-air salvage yards in the mud. Mechanics worked frantically through the night, stripping blown engines, shattered axles and cracked transmissions from wrecked trucks, just to bolt them onto slightly less broken vehicles. But even cannibalisation has its limits. The supply of spare parts evaporated. The vehicles that managed to stay on the road were coughing on contaminated fuel, their suspensions permanently warped, driven by men whose sleep deprivation had moved beyond simple fatigue into a dangerous waking delirium. The entire improvised highway system was operating on the absolute brink of total structural collapse, quite literally eating itself alive just to deliver a fraction of what the front lines demanded. This was the hidden cost of the logistical miracle. The massive American supply machine was coughing, choking, and violently tearing its own gears apart, trying to bridge the ever-expanding gap across France. And in the merciless arithmetic of war, every hour the Americans spent fighting their own broken supply lines was an hour handed directly to the enemy. Across the Lorraine countryside, the sudden, eerie silence of the stalled American vanguard echoed through the German command posts. The Wehrmacht, which had been in a state of absolute shattered panic just days before, stopped running. Officers who had expected to be overrun by American armour instead find themselves staring at empty horizons. They did not need to know the specific math of the Red Ball Express to understand the reality on the ground. They recognised the unmistakable sound of a paralysed offensive. The temporarily disorganised German forces realised the Americans were trapped by their own speed, and in that precise, critical window, they recognised the exact moment to turn around and strike back. The exact magnitude of what the Allied logistical collapse handed to the Wehrmacht is laid bare in the intelligence reports from the first days of September 1944. As the lead elements of Patton's Third Army sat stranded near the Meuse River, their engines cold and their fuel gauges pinned to empty, the path directly in front of them was essentially a ghost town. Post-war analysis and decrypted German communications reveal a staggering tactical reality. In the immediate sector blocking Patton's path into the Lorraine region, the German military had almost ceased to exist. At the precise moment the American tanks ran dry, they were opposed by a phantom defence consisting of just 9 battered, understrength infantry battalions. Backing them up were merely 2 operational artillery batteries and a grand total of about 10 functional tanks. In the brutal calculus of mechanised warfare, this was not a defensive line. It was a speed bump. A fully fueled American armoured division would not have even needed to deploy into complex combat formations to break it. They could have simply driven through it in an afternoon. The road to the Moselle River and the vital approaches to the German border beyond it lay completely exposed. The golden window for a rapid, catastrophic breakthrough was wide open. But a tank without gasoline is just a heavily armoured pillbox. The crews of the M4 Shermans could do nothing but sit on their turrets and stare eastward at an undefended horizon they were physically unable to cross. The aggressive, deafening momentum of the American breakout was abruptly replaced by the agonising sound of cooling metal. And during those crucial days of the forced American standstill, that golden window violently slammed shut. The German High Command, acting with the ruthless efficiency of a cornered animal, exploited the logistical pause. Recognising that the American spearhead was immobilised, Berlin frantically redirected every available asset to plug the gaping hole in their lines. Troop trains that had been chaotic and disorganised suddenly found a clear destination. The Wehrmacht scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel, rushing hastily assembled battle groups, convalescing veterans and newly formed units into the Lorraine Gap.
Flak cannons were ripped from the defence of German cities and repurposed as lethal anti-tank screens along the highways. Most importantly, the Germans fell back to the Moselle River. Just a few days prior, the Americans could have seized the river crossings entirely unopposed. Now, German engineers were given the precious time to rig the bridges for demolition, dig entrenched machine gun positions into the commanding eastern heights, and pre-sight their newly arrived artillery batteries on the crossing points. The muddy banks of the Moselle were systematically transformed from a geographic feature into a fortified kill zone. When the improvised logistics network finally managed to drag enough fuel to the front lines and the engines of the Third Army roared back to life nearly a week later, the tactical reality had completely mutated. The Americans dropped their clutches and rolled forward, expecting to seamlessly resume their lightning pursuit.
Instead, they drove directly into a wall of interlocking fire. The phantom defence of 9 battered battalions had been replaced by a hardened, organised and deeply entrenched front. The nearly open road to the Rhine was gone. In its place stood the Lorraine campaign, a brutal, freezing, multi-month slog through mud, flooded rivers and concrete bunkers. The delay, caused strictly by empty fuel tanks, meant that American infantrymen would now have to pay in blood for every single yard of ground they could have taken for free just days earlier. Looking back at those paralysed tanks, one question continues to haunt military historians. Did the Allies actually lose a definitive, unique chance to end the war in 1944? For decades, supporters of General Patton have vehemently argued that if the gasoline had simply kept flowing, the Third Army would have easily punched through the unmanned bunkers of the Siegfried Line. They believed American armoured columns could have crossed the Rhine River and driven straight into the industrial heart of the Reich before the German High Command could even issue the orders to stop them. It is a seductive alternate history, driven entirely by tactical ambition and the desperate desire for a quick, decisive end to the bloodshed. But modern military analysis points to a far more dangerous, unforgiving reality. Even if Patton had miraculously received the fuel to squeeze out a few more days of forward momentum, he would have been driving an increasingly exhausted army deeper into hostile territory, stretching an already fractured supply line to its absolute breaking point. Pushing headlong into Germany without a secure logistical foundation, without functioning railways, without the massive intake capacity of the port of Antwerp, and without protected flanks, could have invited a catastrophic strategic disaster. A deeply overextended American vanguard could have been easily surrounded, cut off from its rear echelons, and systematically annihilated by a desperate German counterattack. The true revelation of the August halt is not that the American military machine briefly failed, but rather how it managed to survive its own structural collapse.
The continuation of the Allied offensive in the autumn of 1944 was not a testament to a flawless, unbreakable supply system masterminded by planners in London. Those original blueprints had completely disintegrated the moment the tanks broke out of Normandy. Instead, the advance was saved entirely by frantic, agonising improvisation. It was salvaged by the brutal, grinding creation of the Red Ball Express, the subsequent exhaustive labour of combat engineers working around the clock to rebuild shattered French railways, and the massive, unglamorous effort to finally open major deep-water ports to feed the mechanised beast. This salvation exacted a heavy toll.
The price of outrunning their own supply lines was paid in thousands of destroyed cargo trucks, burned-out engines, exhausted personnel, severely delayed autumn operations, and the irreplaceable loss of time. The conflicts between the tactical ambition to win quickly and the cold requirements of strategic sustainability had forced a brutal reset. The ultimate lesson of the August halt goes far beyond empty fuel tanks and shattered timetables. It reveals the true anatomy of industrial warfare. The American logistical machine did not triumph in Europe because it was a flawless, limitless system that never broke down. It triumphed because when it did catastrophically shatter under the weight of its own explosive success, the United States possessed the raw industrial capacity and the staggering human endurance to force a massive course correction in real time. Victory was not secured by perfect foresight, but by the thousands of exhausted drivers, mechanics and combat engineers who physically dragged the Allied armies back into motion. They won because they could recognise a fatal strategic crisis, mobilise a desperate, improvised solution, and completely rebuild a broken system just before the chilling silence of the American guns could become permanent.